Hello, welcome to chapter 12. Checking my pen. This is part 2, chapter 12. So we're characterizing and classifying eukaryotes. So this video is on fungus. So fungi are eukaryotes, or you could call them eukaryotic fungi, and they are specifically you've seen this diagram before. On the y-axis is the carbon source, and on the x-axis is the energy source. And so we've come down here in this quadrant for chemoheterotrophs, and we find fungi and most animals, so that's us. So along with fungi, we are chemoheterotrophs. So that means they get their carbon from organic compounds like proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. As you know, we eat that. And then they get their energy source from chemical compounds. Eukaryotic fungi include yeast, and yeasts are single cells. And down here in the corner, here's a photograph of rapid rise yeast. So if you've ever tried to make homemade bread, you know what that is. Also, eukaryotic fungi include cellular molds. So here's a delicious piece of bread with this mold growing on it. So, and also, for example, we see a lot of oranges here in Tucson, and you pick up an orange maybe that's been lying underneath a tree, and you see that white, green, fuzzy stuff. That is fungi, and a special type of fungi called a mold. And then eukaryotic fungi also include mushrooms, all kind of mushrooms. And we said they were chemoheterotrophic. Fungi don't have chlorophyll, and they do not do photosynthesis like plants do, because plants have chlorophyll, for example. And algae as well do photosynthesis. So when we say fungi are eukaryotes, that means they have membrane-bound organelles. So they have that phospholipid bilayer membrane around the nucleus. They have it around their mitochondria. These are the organelles. The nucleus, the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, etc. Fungi have cell walls, and they're not made of peptidoglycan like the bacterial cell walls that we've been talking about, but they usually, in their cell walls, they have this component called chitin that's found in insects and crabs and makes them crunchy. So the significance of eukaryotic fungi, which include yeast, molds, and mushrooms, they're extremely beneficial to some organisms, not so beneficial to others, but in this slide we're talking about fungi that form mycorrhizae or mycorrhizae, depends on how you like to say it, which is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and the root of a vascular plant. So this would be a root of a vascular plant. Here's another root of a vascular plant, and then these kind of web-looking things, those are that's the fungus, and the relationship is called, between the fungus and the root of the plant, is called a mycorrhizae. The fungus can help the plant absorb water and nutrients from the soil into the root. Fungi, you probably know this, they decompose dead organisms, and they help recycle nutrients, so they're important in the whole scheme of things. And also, as you know, you can use mushrooms for food. And a mushroom is a fungus. Scientists use fungi to study metabolism. You can use fungi for religious ceremonies because, as you know, some mushrooms are hallucinogenic. You use fungi to manufacture food and beverages, and fungi are also the source of drugs, for example, penicillin. Okay, that's nasty right in the middle of the screen. Little athlete's foot caused by a fungus. So some fungi produce mycoses. So those are fungal diseases that are in plants and animals, including us, because we're animals. And this is obviously a photograph of athlete's foot, but fungi can also cause these other diseases. Fungi spoil fruit, etc. And these guys, Beetle and Tatum, received a Nobel Prize using the fungi neurospora to understand that one gene can lead to one enzyme, which isn't exactly true, but it started really understanding the structure of genes. Okay, a single cell, remember, a single-celled fungus is a yeast, and a yeast, if it's not budding, then the body of the yeast is called the vegetative body. That means it's in a state, the yeast is in a state where it's not reproducing. Thalli, that's plural of thallus, thalli of not yeast but multicellular molds, so as opposed to a single-celled yeast, multicellular molds, their thalli are long branched, they have a lot of nuclei, they're tubular structures, and these are called hyphae, and they could be septate or aseptate. So let's look at this scanning electron micrograph first. So here's a single-celled yeast thallus, and here is a bud off that yeast. And then here's a cartoon of the thalli of multicellular mold. So they're long. You can see these thalli are long, and they branch. So there's the branch. They have multi-nucleus. They're multi-nucleated. So 1, 2, 3, 4 nuclei in this picture. And then the hyphae, they could be septate or aseptate. So septum is Latin for wall. So here's a septate hypha, and here you don't see any of those walls. So this would be an example of an aseptate, or without a wall of a hyphae, or singular hypha. So we said yeasts are unicellular fungi. If you find a yeast cell and you see a scar here, it shows that they have undergone asexual reproduction. And a lot of medically relevant fungi, you can see them, you can see their hyphae under a microscope, and you can get them off of dead surfaces of a human host. So for example, maybe the dead skin cells of that previous picture, athlete's foot. Or if they get inside a cell, inside a human host, you can also see their hyphae. So some fungi produce a yeast-like or mold-like thalli depending on the environment that it's in. So that means some fungi, depending on the environment they're living in, can make different types of thalli. And they're called dimorphic fungi. So here's the cartoon. If you grow the fungi in this SDA media, so they're growing on this plate and this is the temperature, then the fungi will take the mold form. And so you can see the hyphae here, these brown structures, those are the hyphae. If, however, you take the same fungus and you grow it in BHI media at this temperature, that fungus will take the yeast form. So here's a thallus of yeast, here's a thallus, and then these little guys would be a bud off a thallus. Thalli can also form a tangled mass, and that's called a mycelium. And the mycelium is the entire interwoven mass of one multicellular organism. So this whole thing, all this white stuff, this is a multicellular fungus forming this structure called a mycelium. And this is a light micrograph. This is pretty big because this is 10 millimeters, and we can see in the millimeter range. So this is a big structure. So we mentioned earlier fungal diseases in humans. Fungi in general can be pathogenic. That means they can make us sick. They can be mutualistic, so they can kind of work together with whatever organism they're working with, or they can be neither. So this fungus called trichophyton can cause a superficial mycosis. So mycosis, remember, is a fungal disease on the skin. Coccidioides, that's valley fever. Everyone's heard of that. These other fungi, blastomyces, histoplasma fungi, can cause systemic mycosis, so that's in your internal organs. If the patient comes in, he presents with itchy, inflamed skin surrounding their toes, that type of mycosis would be a superficial one, and as opposed to a systemic fungal infection, which usually begins as a respiratory infection. So you breathe in the fungus, and then it can get into your body and affect the organs. And then here's just a checklist of fungal diseases in humans. So you can have an allergic reaction to fungus. So if you've inhaled a fungal spore, you can react to a fungal toxin. So we talked about fungi having hallucinogenic properties. And we talked about a mycosis being a fungal disease. And it can be superficial, so that's on the skin, intermediate, or systemic. So superficial is on the skin, systemic is inside the body, and then intermediate is somewhere in between. So here's a little bit more about valley fever. It shows the life cycle of valley fever. The fungus that causes valley fever, as we said, is Coccidioides immitis. It grows in the ground, and then it shows in this cartoon, you can inhale the fungus through your nasal passage, and then can get into your lungs, and then from the lungs it could get into your bloodstream and cause valley fever. Here's a map of valley fever, and look where we are. Tucson, highly endemic. So, like I said, probably everyone's heard of that. What about the nutrition of eukaryotic fungi? So this is a nematode, aka a roundworm, and this is the hyphal loop of a fungus here. And this fungus is going to eat slowly over time. It's kind of smaller than a nematode, well, at least in this scanning electron micrograph, will eventually ingest and digest the nematode. So fungi absorb nutrients from dead organisms, but some fungal species will trap and kill microscopic nematodes, like in this micrograph. Probably people have heard of a yeast disease called Candida. Candida can sometimes cause a mild yeast infection, but if it gets into your bloodstream, it can make you really sick. So Candida albicans, here's a diagram of what that looks like. You find Candida in warm, moist environments. So you can see here, it's called thrush. Probably heard of that when it gets in your oral cavity. And then in the vagina. it's just generally called a yeast infection. So fungi in general can reproduce asexually, but so all fungi can reproduce asexually. Most fungi can also reproduce sexually. That's kind of cool. And then they use, if they're reproducing asexually, they can use budding, fragmentation, and spore formation. Those are types of asexual reproduction. The budding yeast, Candida albicans, causes thrush and vaginal infections. Reproduction of eukaryotic fungi. This is a cartoon of sexual spore formation. So you have, in step 1, you have this cell here, and the yeast is called a dikaryon. It means it has 2 sets of nuclei. And then the nuclei will fuse together to go from being a dikaryon to the diploid stage. And then the yeast will, the fungus will undergo meiosis. It's like our sperm and egg in humans undergoes meiosis. And then you get this haploid stage, and you get these positive and negative spores that continue the cycle. So fungal mating types are positive or negative. They don't have male and female. Haploid cells form, and haploid cells just means they have half the complement of chromosomes. And we talked about that, and that starts the cycle all over again. We said that fungi, when they're reproducing asexually, they can form spores, and then they have these structures: sporangiospores, chlamydospores, and candidospores. And here's some photographs of those. Yeast, we said they're single cells, and they're also facultative anaerobes. So that means they can use oxygen if it's there, but they don't have to use oxygen to survive. So here's a cartoon. We've gone over this in previous lectures, but so molecule of glucose undergoes the process of glycolysis to make 2 ATP, and the product of glycolysis is 2 pyruvate molecules. If oxygen is present in these facultative anaerobes called yeast, then the pyruvate can go on to the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and make a whole lot of ATP. If, however, oxygen is not present, then pyruvate will do a process called fermentation, and that's in this diagram. So the 2 pyruvate will give off a couple carbon dioxide, that's gas, in the gas form. It will make 2 acetaldehyde molecules, and then when it takes 2 NADHs and makes them into NAD, the yeast make ethanol, and you know that's alcohol. And then the NAD plus can go back into glycolysis, pick up some more electrons, come back into fermentation, and you can keep this cycle going for a long time, and you don't need oxygen, and you can make a lot of ethanol, which is what yeast do. So there's this organism called a lichen. I don't know if you've heard of it before. It grows usually if the environment is not polluted. So out in the boonies somewhere where there's not a lot of pollution, you can find lichens, and you can find them on rocks, soil, leaves, even the backs of tortoises. So this photograph here. And then in this looks like it might be a statue or maybe part of a gravestone. So the lichen is growing there. But a lichen it's a mutualistic partnership. So both the fungi and the photosynthetic microbe gets something out of the partnership. And the photosynthetic microbe in that lichen can either be green algae or it can be cyanobacteria. And the fungus in the lichen, it's usually this type of fungus called an ascomycete. Lichens help create soil from weathered rocks. So you probably know what rocks get broken down over time as they're weathered, and you can make soil from that. Lichens may contain these things called nitrogen fixers. So those are bacteria that can take atmospheric nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turn it into a form of nitrogen that plants can use. Many animals like to eat lichens, like caribou and Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. And then here's some photographs, or this is a scanning electron micrograph of an algae or an algal cell that is surrounded by a fungus. And then I didn't know where to put this because it's just one slide, but algae are eukaryotes, they're not a fungus. You can also call them phytoplankton when they're all living together. Most are aquatic. You probably know that. You find algae mostly in the sea. But you can also find algae in the soil. You can find algae in lice. And then you can find algae in lichens like we just looked at. Algae are photosynthetic and they're the major source of oxygen for the world. So algae, in terms of making oxygen, are more important than plants. And here's a photograph of a giant brown alga with this thing called a pneumocyst. And if you've ever driven over to San Diego, you probably see a lot of these guys, giant kelp, washing up on the beaches.